The rifle, the rebar gun, and the Nobelisk are the three main forms of range combat in Satisfactory. However, all three of these weapons have different ammo types and drastic cost differences. So, which one do you use? Well, in this three-part miniseries, we'll cover rebar ammunition, rifle ammunition, and then Nobelisks in the final part of the miniseries. This is part 1, so we are talking about the rebar gun. First, let's go over the basics. You unlock the rebar gun itself through the MAM, and more specifically through the alien megafauna category. Here's a closer look. Firstly, you have to gather alien DNA remains. This is done rather easily using a Xenobasher or a Xenozapper. You then have to create your alien DNA capsules. Then after that, you'll be given 4 different categories to unlock, all of which are rather good respectively, but the one that we're interested in is this one down here. This is your rebar gun. Additionally, you also get extra storage and item inventory slots, so this is actually a pretty good category to research early game. The rebar gun itself, you can actually build it in the equipment workshop, and it will set you back 6 reinforced iron plates, 16 iron rods, and 100 screws. So again, it's rather cheap for the early game progression. Additionally, as we can see, there are 4 different ammo types. We've got iron rebar, we've got stun rebar, shatter rebar, and explosive rebar. So let's go over all of them and actually see which one's best. Here we get a little bit more information about the rebar gun itself. For example, it can sink for almost 2,000 points, which is not great if I'm honest, so I don't particularly recommend sinking a bunch of these for points. Of course, with the ammo types we'll eventually discuss, and the rate of fire and the reload time is 0.37 seconds for the rate of fire and 1.8 seconds for the reload time. Tune into our rifle video to see how this compares. Starting off with the iron rebar, since you have to craft this in order to make anything else. So no matter what you do, if you choose any of these 3 recipes here, you have to make iron rebar, and they are extremely cheap to make. All you need is iron rods, and literally that is it. It's a 1-to-1 ratio as well, so 1 iron rod makes 1 iron rebar. As we can see, this thing isn't necessarily overpowered. It's a 2-shot tap, however you have to land your shots. There's other ammunition types that we'll talk about today where you don't necessarily have to hit your target and you'll still do damage, but with this one you have got to be accurate. So when it comes to things like stingers, which is essentially the spiders in the game, be cautious because they are a bit more difficult to hit than it may seem. And let's go over the iron rebar stats page. The most important thing is this, and this. First of all, it stacks for 100, which is not too bad, and it sinks just for 8 points, which is not great at all. However, for a comparison, iron rods sink for just 4 points. You actually get double the amount of points for sinking the iron rebar compared to the iron rod. And lastly, this thing does 15 damage, which is okay, but really not that great. Moving on now to the stun rebar, and this thing requires, again, your 10 iron rebar to make your 10 stun rebars, but it also requires 50 quick-wire as well. So essentially, 5 quick-wire for 1 stun rebar. Put that into perspective, that's roughly 1 Caterium ingot per shot, or 3 Caterium ore if you are using the basic Caterium recipes in Satisfactory. And as the name might suggest, this electrocutes the tiger on impact, stunning it for a short time. And it only has a 5-second duration. I tried getting some B-roll clip of me actually using this thing, and it doesn't really do much damage, it literally just stuns the enemy. So you can fire a shot with your rebar gun then finish it off with your rifle. This might help for bigger boss fights. And finally, the stats on the stun rebar, as we can see down here again. For the stack size, this thing stacks for 100, the same as I think everything on this list. It sinks for 186 points, which is significantly better than the iron rebar, but which is kind of self-explanatory obviously. However, it only has, and this is not a mistake, 5 damage. You might as well be hitting an enemy with a flip-flop. It does not do any damage, this thing, at all. But if you just want to try and stick to one ammunition type, I don't really recommend the stun rebar. If you've got it, you might want to use it, but there's other things on the list that might be slightly better, such as the Shatter Rebar, which is the next ammunition type we'll be talking about. Just very quickly, if you enjoy videos like this and you want more guides, tips and tricks, then feel free to subscribe if you wish. You don't have to, but it's a good way to support the channel. You'll also get notified whenever I drop one of these videos. Thank you for all the continued support on the channel, but without further ado, let's get straight back into the video. This requires 2 iron rebar for 1 shatter rebar, and it also requires 3 quartz crystals again for one Shatter Rebar. This might be kind of steep, especially if you haven't got enough quartz crystals, but let's take a closer look. So as we can see, our 3 quartz crystals cost 5 raw quartz, or you could use the refinery. Now if you do that, it only costs you 3.857 raw quartz, but it does cost you some additional water, so I wouldn't really recommend this necessarily, or this method necessarily, for making your quartz crystals if you're only making 3 per minute. But if you're making hundreds of these things, then yes, this might be a good idea for you depending on your resource limitations. i.e. if you haven't got enough quartz crystals, if you've got tons of water near you, then use this. But if you're trying to save some power and you haven't got a lot of water near you, then just use the basic constructor recipe. The exact definition of the Shatter Rebar is fractures when shot, launching deadly debris with widespread but limited range. Essentially, it's a shotgun. And here's the background footage for that. As we can see, when I'm quite far away from the enemy, it doesn't do much damage, obviously. But when you're close to an enemy, it actually does really good damage. I am thoroughly surprised by how good this actually is. I've never used it in my life, I never really saw a reason to. But if you're constantly in close quarter combat, then yes, this Shatter Rebar is actually really good. You are going to have double the iron rebar compared to other rebar ammunition, but overall, not too bad. And now let's talk about the stats of the Shatter Rebar itself. Firstly, it stacks for 100, what a surprise. It sinks for 332 points, not too bad. And damage-wise, it does 30 damage, although I'm sure, again, this does change depending on how far away from the enemy you are, like we've already discussed. If you're really close, it does a lot of damage. If you're far away, it's terrible, so do bear that in mind. It's about time that we got into Explosive Rebar, which, believe it or not, is what it says on the tin. It explodes on impact, dealing heavy damage. I use this a lot, so I could probably tell you how good this actually is, but as we can see down here, it is not cheap, so let's go into this a little bit more. Firstly, you need 2 iron rebar to create 1 explosive rebar, so it's 2 for the price of 1 essentially. You also need 2 smokeless powder, which is made from heavy oil residue, so unfortunately, yes, you have got to get crude oil involved for this recipe, and 2 black powder, which is made combining coal and sulfur, but those are the 2 recipes for it. Luckily though, you only need 1 heavy oil residue per minute and 2 black powder per minute, which as we can see is extremely cheap and affordable. It will end up costing you a lot, for example 1 coal and 1 sulfur. This goes into our 2 black powder, which then makes our rest of our powder recipes to then form the 1 explosive rebar ammunition. It's not a lot of resources, however, it's a lot of moving parts. For example, you've got to gather the coal and the sulfur, you've then got to put it into the assembler, you've then got to get your refinery involved, and then you can actually make your explosive rebar ammunition. So this thing isn't necessarily cheap to make, and of course we haven't even talked about steel pipes just yet. However, it's very good. When it comes to steel pipes, there's 3 different recipes you can try and use. The basic one just requires regular steel ingots. However, you can also use an iron pipe recipe if you don't want to get extra coal involved. Or if you want to try and save on iron and on coal, but get a bit of concrete involved, you can make molded steel pipes. I have made an entire video discussing steel in Satisfactory, and I do recommend checking that out for further analysis. As we can see here with the background b-roll, this thing is amazing. I've been using it on all of my streams whenever I go exploring, and I absolutely love the explosive rebar ammunition. Yes, it's a bit pricey, but when you do it, trust me, it actually ends up being really good. I can vouch for it because, again, I use it. And lastly, let's discuss the stats of the explosive rebar. It has a stack size of 100, really? Wow. And in regards of sink points, it can sink for 360 points, which is not too bad. And damage is 50. But let's compare all 3 of the rebar ammunition together. And this is what we get. The rebar that has the least amount of damage is the stun rebar, and the most damage is the explosive rebar. The explosive rebar also has the most sink points, and of course everything has a stack size of 100. So if we're just basing this off stats rather than cost, then the explosive rebar is the best in every single category here. Not to mention again that explosive rebar does actually damage the environment around it, which can be fantastic. And just to elaborate, it doesn't destroy anything you've built. So it's not like if you fire this towards your factory, it's going to destroy everything. No, it destroys things like trees and gas pillars, which can be really awesome. In case you can't tell, I quite like this thing. So let's conclude what we learned about the rebar gun. Iron rebar is necessary for everything. No matter what you do, you have to make iron rebar. But luckily, it's not that expensive. You can just make it in a constructor or handcraft it if you really want to in the equipment workshop. But again, I do recommend just making this in the constructor if you are doing a big weapons factory. If not, then, well, it's still worth it anyway. When it comes to the stun rebar, this thing is okay. What you could do is use your stun rebar ammunition on an enemy, and then whip out something like a Xenobasher, which is essentially this melee stick, which is extremely good. And then hit the enemy a couple times, rinse and repeat that strategy, and you should be okay, because when an enemy's locked in a stun position, it cannot react, which is pretty decent. Moving on to the Shatter Rebar, again, this thing is essentially a shotgun. At distance, this thing is dreadful. But close range, it's really good. And I'm not sure about you, but most of the engagements I get in Satisfactory, at least, are close range, especially when dealing with hogs. Of course, when you're dealing with something like a radioactive hog, you want to try and keep your distance. But if you are dealing with something that you prefer a bit more close CQC combat, close quarter combat, then I do recommend using the Shatter Rebar. Because again, short distance, this thing is really good. And it's a one-shot as well with the lower tier mobs. Lastly, again, the explosive rebar, which in my opinion is the best rebar ammunition in Satisfactory 1.0 so far. They might add another version later on down the line, but as of the time of recording, on the 3rd of January 2025, I think this is the best ammunition in the game. Yes, it will cost you a decent amount of power to make this thing, but the explosive rebar ammunition can also be used to destroy trees, walls, and a lot of other things as well. Like, not like your concrete walls, but like actual in-game walls that block things like summer sloops and mercer spheres. It destroys the environment, essentially, which is fantastic in regards of Satisfactory. So explosive rebar also has other uses as well, which is again why I think it's the best ammo type in Satisfactory 1.0. If you made it this far, comment down below, what is your favorite rebar ammunition in Satisfactory 1.0? I would love to know what you guys think. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, a massive thank you to the channel members: Chaos Rising, Scotland Hattie, Mau Mau, Natormal, Yamikel Burns, Variants, Asuna, Nicole Still Plays, and Zhao. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.